Okay, I'll be done by 1:30.
My apologies again.
No problem. I'll wrap this up in about 10 minutes.
Full assembly is beginning.
On the opposite side of this building. On the opposite side of this building. In the grass. In the grass.
I'm the grass.
Okay, I'm going to wrap this up in about 10 minutes. And I'll talk loud. Okay, so what we've seen here during this era of big stimulus is that labor force participation has increased a lot. Now, here's the reality. The Republicans have been talking about, let's redo the Reagan strategy of lower taxes and less deregulation. The Democrats are saying we need more stimulus. We need to get the economy to grow again. The reality is neither one of these strategies is going to work. For the Republican strategy, when Reagan did that, the top rate was 70%. When you go from 70 to 28%, and when you have 20% manufacturing, there's some place for the money to go. So that worked reasonably well. Now, during the first Bush and through Clinton, that went back up to 39%. But if we turn to the next page, we can see that on this blue line, this is the federal deficit, that went up significantly during Reagan, but by the time that Clinton left office, we were running a surplus. So even when you have 40% taxes for the high rate, if you have some manufacturing going on for the money to have someplace to go, and during the dot-com revolution during the late 90s, the economy can work just fine at that rate, okay? But today, if you try to adjust between 25 and 35%, that's not going to have that much impact to begin with. Beyond that, there's no place for the money to go. We're offshoring, we're outsourcing. We have 10% manufacturing in the U.S. today. Now, of that, for domestic consumption, we have the auto industry and the paper industry. Believe it or not, paper and printing as an industry is about as big as the entire domestic auto industry. That's how big it is. And it has a big impact on Minnesota. We have the crucial resources for paper. We've got water, inexpensive electricity, and pulp. That's what paper industry requires. So this is going to hurt us going forward, no question about it. But if you subtract out domestic auto production and the paper and printing industry, our economy devotes 2%, 1.8, less than 2% of our total output is for all consumer goods. There is no place for the money to go. So in terms of the Republican strategy, if you go between 25 and 40%, the only question you've got is, are you going to collect the money as taxes or are you going to borrow it? It's still going to come in, it's just a question whether you want to pay interest on it. It is not going to work as a strategy. Now, the Democrat strategy, I've got what I call the Drunken Sailor Index. This is something I've developed. How many of you have heard of the Misery Index during the Carter? Okay, that was unemployment plus inflation. Well, I've got the Drunken Sailor Index on stimulus, and this is the federal deficit plus the trade deficit as a percentage of economic growth. And my theory is very simple. If your deficits are growing faster than your economy, you're in drunken sailor territory. So let's take a look at this. In 1980, this actually started during the Reagan administration. Before that, these deficits were below economic growth. So, you can say Reagan was the first one to get in the social drinking category, 1 or 2 per day. But again, there was a strategy there that there was a place for the money to go, and it did win the Cold War. Now, when you go forward, Clinton and the dot-com, these things improved to the point where we got a surplus again. The Bush administration from 2000 to 2008 is where this drunken sailor policy really took off. His average for 8 years was 9% above economic growth. Our trade deficit and our federal deficit were growing an average of 9% a year above economic growth. Now, we look at the number for Obama. And obviously this is not all Obama's fault. You can argue on the margins about the stimulus, but the trend has continued and the economy has shrunk. We're at 10 million people working in 07 are not working now. So in terms of our index, we're at 18%. Our trade deficit and our federal deficit are 18% of economic growth, above economic growth for the entire average. Now, here's my point on this very simply. This is unsustainable. So the reality of our situation is that we've had an era of big stimulus. It started with Reagan, and it's been going on for 30 years. We've been using it to kind of bump along the economy to get more people in the labor force, and the whole thing is blowing up and it's not going to work. So we need to look at what solutions might work going forward. One of them, in my view, is protectionism. That means that we're going to have a tariff that is the difference between U.S. wages and foreign wages, plus environmental costs, plus energy costs. If you do that, first of all, it will produce tax revenue, so it will reduce the federal deficit. Second, it will produce a place for this money to go for investments again. And that will happen over a period of time. You're going to see technology replacing a lot of those jobs. And in the short term, that will be a job stimulus. That's one thing we need to do. We need to reform Social Security. The reality is, again, 10 million people working in 07, they're not working now. The reality is these people are not unemployed. They're retired. They did not choose retirement. Retirement chose them. But if we're going to reform Social Security, let's take into account and put in a policy that if you were working in 07, you're not working now, and you're age 55 up, you can sign off and say, I'm withdrawing from the labor force, and you can then collect your full Social Security benefits, not the 60% at age 62. And the point is that we've got too many people in the workforce. And we need to make room for younger people. So that can be structured as part of Social Security reform. That will not hit the deficit. One thing I wanted to draw your attention to on the last page, the impact on the budget. The reality there is that we've got income security expenditures. That's long-term unemployment and food stamps. That's about $257 billion. And then we've got Medicaid for people that have been displaced. That's about $86 billion. So we have about $350 billion that represents the cost to the government for palliative care for this 10 million people that have been displaced. As I see it, this is simply a structural part of the reality of our budget that we need to face going forward. These people need to eat. They need to have some place to live. And again, they didn't choose unemployment for 55 up. Retirement chose them. Other than that, this is a game of musical chairs, and the music has stopped. There's 10 million more people that had jobs, they don't have jobs now. So, it's pointless to just talk about personal responsibility, you got to go out and get a job. It just doesn't add up. So, we're looking at protectionism, we're looking at continuing the palliative care, we're looking at reform for Social Security. These are some of the things that we can do. One other thing I think we can do goes back to that labor force participation. We should start to rethink what households are and start to recognize, it used to be, well, let's take, let me ask a hypothetical question. What is the gross domestic product of the Garden of Eden? What is the number? Zero. And the reason is there's a huge blind spot in economics. Economics cannot see the creation of value if there is no monetary exchange. So you say, what's the economic value of a housewife? Zero. There's no exchange. Well, that is totally unrealistic. Now, what we have to look at is that if this labor force participation is going to go down, we need to have a way to redefine households so that instead of just having that based on marriage, you can have it based on a lasting agreement between a group of people to form a household. Let's not sexualize it. Well, why should we require that if you're going to have the benefits of a household that you have to marry somebody of your same sex? Why not allow households to be defined without reference to sex? Because when you have a household, you have some people that are not working in the employed market, but they are creating value for the household. So that's another thing that we got to take a look at with this economic meltdown is one of the consequences. We need to redefine households. Now, what time is it?
1:20. Yeah, it's starting over there right now, yeah.
Okay. Any questions? Yeah, John has got some copies.
That's interesting, especially the
Thank you.
protectionism.
Thank you. And here's... Yep, I'll get one from John. You bet.